It's Pennsylvania Newsmakers time, and as always, thanks for joining us. Well, let's take up early intervention for infants and toddlers, a little education for young folks. But first, what else? A post-primary review. We'll get to all of that after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
All right, a lot to get into on the program this week, and joining me, we're going to start with two journalists, Justin Sweitzer, he's the Capitol reporter. He's with City and State Pennsylvania, and Tom Lehman, he's the Capitol reporter with WGAL. All right, Tom, I'll start with you. We actually had a primary election.
Yeah, I mean,
even though the turnout was low and there weren't a lot of what I'll call competitive races. Do I got that about right?
I think it depends on how you look at it. There were some competitive down ballot races, if you will, but for the most part, we saw a lot of statewide races decided by some pretty big margins. Turnout down for the most part. Yeah. I think everybody agreed about that. But the biggest thing, obviously, we now know who are going to be competing for the statewide offices here in Pennsylvania, certainly for the state treasurer, auditor, and attorney general races. And while not as important for the grand scheme of things as the governor's office maybe.
And U.S. Senate.
Sure, U.S. Senate race, although that was unopposed. Bob Casey on the Democrat side and Dave McCormick on the Republican side.
But
no surprises
the race
there.
In Pennsylvania between McCormick and Casey could decide which party controls the United States Senate.
And that's why it's critically important. I think a lot of people are looking at Pennsylvania right now. They're wondering how that's going to go. Not only that, but what the effect of Donald Trump on the Republican side being at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, translation, important elections coming up in the state, and as usual, we're going to be one of the most visited states by the candidates and their surrogates in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, I'd point out, Terry, we've seen a lot of movement from the Biden campaign, even in the last few weeks, looking to,
You mean Scranton-born Biden?
Scranton-born Biden, that's correct. His campaign has opened up a lot of Pennsylvania infrastructure, a lot of campaign offices over the last several weeks. And we've already seen visits from both candidates. So, I'm sure that's going to pick up as as this cycle moves on. And I'll just point to Tom quick. We were talking about the Trump presidential primary results, and there was a significant number of Pennsylvania voters who cast their vote for Nikki Haley, who has since dropped out of the race.
Right.
And Tom, I don't know if you want to speak to the significance of that.
I mean, if you've got 150,000 votes for a person who dropped out of the race months ago, I think a lot of Republicans are going to be looking at that and wondering about Donald Trump's viability at the top of the ballot. If you've got people,
some legal problems to deal with,
right? Certainly legal problems, but apparently in the eyes of many, a lot of favorability issues as well. If people are voting, again, for a candidate who hasn't been in this race for so long, I think some people are wondering if we're in for a repeat performance, at least in Pennsylvania.
I want to point out that President Biden was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He lived there until he was 10 years old when his family moved him down to Delaware, but elected to the United States Senate from Delaware in 1972, and he repeatedly spent time in our state referring to himself as Scranton-born, or as he liked to put it, I'm one of you. He would say, I'm one of you. And he campaigned frequently for Pennsylvania Democrats, but he also did a lot of speeches and programs as well in the state.
Right. And, it's interesting, again, looking at, how the presidential primaries this cycle shook out, because, as Tom mentioned, there wasn't a lot of competition there. No. No other major nominees or candidates that stood a chance at becoming the nominee.
So barring his legal problems with Trump, it looks like a Trump-Biden
I mean, certainly. I think we've been trending that way for months. But I think,
months, yeah.
you know, for Pennsylvanians who are going to be heading to the polls, I think that might be an interesting question, especially with what we saw in 2020. That's the last, you know, marker that we can look back to and say, how did these two candidates perform? What kind of effect did it have on the other candidates? 2022, Democrats obviously made some big gains, took back the state house, but neither of the presidential candidates was technically at the top of the ticket.
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to see, with both of these candidates coming back again, whether or not they have an effect on all of these down ballot races.
Yeah. Well, let's run to a break. When we come back, let's go down ballot to some other important elections that we all care about after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, I'm chatting with a couple of reporters, and we're taking a look at the primary election results from Tuesday's primary. Relatively low turnout, but you know, we did the statewide races. Actually, there were other statewide nomination ballots on as well. Justin Sweitzer from City and State.
Right. So in addition to the presidential candidates at the top of the ticket, there were three major statewide races on the ballot. We had state treasurer, who's in charge of managing state finances. We had the auditor general primary, which the auditor general's in charge of essentially the state's fiscal watchdog, and then we had attorney general, the state's top prosecutor.
Right.
So on the Democratic side, for Attorney General, we had former Auditor General Eugene DePasquale emerge victorious, among a pretty large field of Democrats.
Right.
And then on the Republican side, we had York County District Attorney win the GOP primary. So he'll be moving on to the Attorney General election as the GOP's nominee. So that race is set. We also have the state treasurer race set as well, where incumbent treasurer Stacey Garrity, a Republican, she'll be taking on Democrat Erin McClelland from Allegheny County in the fall.
And what's pretty important is, fortunately for us and our viewers, we've had these candidates on as the office holders in particular. But what's really important about this is these offices, Auditor General, State Treasurer, Attorney General, lead to candidacies for governor and for the United States Senate. So they're what I refer to as stepping stones.
They certainly are. The other race, the Auditor General's race between the incumbent Auditor Tim DeFore, Republican, as well as Democrat Malcolm Kenyatta, is going to be interesting to see. Kenyatta, a state lawmaker, now running for Auditor General, potentially, if he wins that race, would be in a statewide position, which means he can move on to, if you follow that trajectory you were mentioning, Terry, he could potentially look higher. Those might be his aspirations. I can't speak for him. But it is one of those situations right now where you see some of these state lawmakers coming out of the offices they were running for. In the treasurer's race, we saw as one of the other candidates, leading candidates in that race, he is a state lawmaker. Over in the Attorney General's race,
so they go from the State House and State Senate to the row offices, again, Attorney General, State Treasurer, Auditor General, and then perhaps on to the governorship. Both Governor Shapiro and Senator Casey, for example, held row offices before they went into their latest positions.
I think it's worth noting, Terry, too, you know, if you get to that point, you know, these statewide row offices, it does significantly boost your name recognition and your name ID.
That's a good point.
You look at someone like Eugene DePasquale, you know, he's never run for Attorney General before,
Right.
but he has won 2 statewide election cycles as Auditor General. And, you know, he ended up being the Democrat who won the, multi-candidate primary this time around. So, you know, that statewide experience may have given him an example.
Sometimes for these, it's about something called name recognition.
Sure, and I think for Eugene DePasquale, certainly he's been on the ballot before. People know who he is. That may have played well for him when it came to the primary. I think one of the other key things to watch with this, though, is that you're talking about incumbents that are being challenged here on the Republican side, at least for Auditor General and for the Treasurer's Office. And because of that, their names have been out there as well. And these are cases where people may not always be paying attention to the party name on the opposite end of your name. And because of that, it might be interesting to see how exactly these races play out. I think it'll be an interesting bellwether for the state, you know, in terms of statewide support, whether or not Republicans can hold on to these 2 seats, even though they have a pretty big voter disadvantage when you look at the registration numbers.
Yeah. And we can expect, obviously, the turnout in the general election in the fall will be much higher.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, the Oval Office, the presidency being at the top of the ticket will definitely galvanize voters ahead of November in a way that it, you know, probably didn't this April.
All right, thanks for the update. All right, early intervention for infants and toddlers. We're going to talk a little bit about education, an important subject, and we'll get to that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Welcome back. Well, Terry, we don't often talk about education for infants and toddlers, but it's very, very important. To do that, we have a real expert, Kari King. She's the president and CEO of Pennsylvania Partnership for Children. Welcome, Kari.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's start with early intervention for infants and toddlers. So we're not talking about regular schooling yet, are we?
Right, yeah, I've been on this program before talking about pre-K and childcare and those types of services. Early intervention is a little different. It's also our newest area of policy work that we're focused on in the state budget. And when I talk about early intervention, you're really focusing on the youngest citizens of Pennsylvania. So there's kind of 2 parts of the program. One are infants and toddlers, and then one's preschoolers. But it's really looking at developmental delays. So if a parent or a pediatrician is observing a child and is a little bit concerned, it could be on a physical side, cognitive, social, emotional. So these are things like, you know, I'm noticing my baby isn't starting to babble or make eye contact, or as the child grows a little bit, not developing language.
They're picking up signs that they may have learning problems in the future.
Correct. With their development, there's some concern that's kind of being detected. And again, it could be a parent or a caregiver. It could be a pediatrician if the child is in a child care center or their teacher in child care. And what we're really focusing on is that compared to some other programs we advocate for at PPC, there's no eligibility limit for early intervention. Pretty much any parent in the Commonwealth, if there's a concern about your child developing appropriately, you can reach out for an evaluation to see if they should receive services. And just,
so you can get what you're doing evaluated.
Yep, absolutely. And that's really what we're focusing on. It's a critical first step. If you have that concern, Make
Wow.
sure that you get that child those services as soon as possible, because so much of what we focus on is when you invest early in kids, you're saving later on. And early intervention is certainly part of that. If you're addressing those developmental delays, you're going to save on things like special education and those types of costs later on in life.
Yeah, that's pretty important, because customarily we think about education once you go to school, and obviously schools are critically important.
Yeah.
But what goes on before they actually start learning in the classroom is also critically important.
Exactly, and that's right why we went into this policy space, because it does mean so much as a child is entering kindergarten. I think we've started to shift our mindset to make sure we're supporting kids in their development as they get to that school age. And I think early intervention's a really critical part of that. And it helps parents too. That's the other piece of this, where the other thing we always say is parenting doesn't come with an instruction book. And so when you have a trained, and you can have, early intervention providers can be physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech. So there's a variety of different folks that usually come into the home.
So there's formal aspects to it, meaning things that you've studied, that others have studied and analyzed that work, and things that you would avoid doing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a trained professional that works with the caregiver, works with the child, identifies what delay might be there, and then really customizes services to make sure that that child's delay is being addressed, whether it is on the language side, the physical side. So it really is important to get into the home and provide those services as soon as possible.
Well, let's run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about pre-K for Pennsylvania, how widespread it is, and but essentially what you're telling us is this is extremely important, and it varies greatly depending on the home situation. We'll get to that and more soon.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania American Water. We keep life flowing across the Keystone State.
Kari King is my guest, PA Partnership for Children. We're talking about education for, I'll say the young folks, other ones would say children or kids. All right, Kari, I'll tell you something. Pre-K is pre-kindergarten for Pennsylvania. Official formal programming, or is it left to each school district?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is really unique, and I think we should be really proud of our investments in pre-K. It is a formal program that's run through the Office of Child Development and Early Learning in the state. And we have what's called a mixed delivery system. And so by that I mean, yes, school districts certainly provide pre-K, but there's other types of providers that are also authorized to provide the services as long as they're high quality. So like child care centers, Head Start, things like that.
So it's just not formal education.
Yeah, it really focuses on kind of those numbers and letters and making sure you're getting ready for kindergarten. But there's also, I think, a really big social and emotional element to it as well. So making sure kids are comfortable socializing with other children or listening to rules.
And there's programming that's been adopted that is generally accepted as appropriate for children.
Yep.
Before they get to kindergarten.
Absolutely, yeah, and making sure it's high quality where you really see that return on investment, that if you're focusing on those skills with kids that are 3 and 4 years old, you see them doing better as they get into elementary school. There's been a lot of research that shows higher test scores and things like that.
Sure.
So again, you can really see those benefits, but really important that we can make sure that the state funding in the budget is supporting pre-K so that we can provide it to...
I want to get to that in a minute. Now, this has been more formalized and more common than we've seen in the past. Has it been growing year by year?
Yeah. So funding for pre-K in Pennsylvania started in 2007. And it really has been an area since that time that's seen tremendous bipartisan support. So over time, the appropriation has really grown. We are serving a lot of kids, but we always make sure to note that we're still just at about at half. It's about 54% of kids don't have access to pre-K. And that's another important thing, too. This is not required. It's if it works for the family.
But it's been expanding over the years.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, it's I think one of the few areas where we've become increasingly partisan, that you see an equal number of Republicans and Democrats supporting it, because again, they know that there's that return on investment.
So it's not part of it lacks the partisanship that we often see in the legislature.
Yeah, because I think everybody's on the same page that they want kids to start off as strong as possible going into school.
Yeah. Is there any parts of the state where it's stronger than others?
No, there's certainly, it varies from county to county. PPC, my organization, provides data down, we'll talk statewide, but then we'll get to the county level, even legislative district level. And it's kind of twofold. You often think of kind of the more rural areas where there's access, might be a little bit more limited, whether it's pre-K or child care. But it can also be an urban issue, too, when you go into the cities for different reasons. But,
Sure.
It certainly can vary from location to location. So, again, making sure we have that consistency statewide with the state funding is something we push for in the budget.
But the question is whether it gets implemented, not whether it's the right thing to do. I mean, it's generally now accepted that infant and toddler early intervention is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think just holistically, when you're looking at investments in young children, so kind of that birth to age 5 or birth to kindergarten,
right.
I think we've made tremendous progress in the past, decade, 2 decades, with policymakers and the public really seeing the importance of focusing on young children.
Right.
There's a tremendous amount of development that happens during that age span, so it's really that important that we provide services.
And early intervention activities is in the Pennsylvania budget?
Yeah, both early intervention and pre-K are 2 of our big pieces we're pushing in the upcoming state budget. Early intervention, for the part we're focused on, is a proposed increase of $16.6 million in the state budget. So that's what Governor Shapiro proposed, and we're supporting that, and hopefully that'll be part of the final package as we get to June, and hopefully by the end of June. And then pre-K as well, that's a $33 million proposed increase. Right. So supporting that. And I think it's important to note there too, that's also supporting kind of the workforce. We're seeing that across areas we work in, that there are workforce challenges.
But not a lot of partisan differences there. I wouldn't think there'd be partisan differences.
No. I think it's, at the end of the day, how are the budget numbers working and how much can they direct to young children in the state? And it's about getting as much as possible and continuing to build that support.
Yeah, and it continues to grow.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we're encouraged.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's as they say, a no-brainer.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it really has been kind of this shift in philosophy in terms of how we can prepare our kids, and again, it saves money in the long run.
Yeah. Well, look, I think this has been an extremely important update, and you'll come back and keep us posted on it, and we'll follow the progress, because this is too important. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.